Okay, let's just dive right into this explainer. Today we're looking at how a seemingly simple, really joyful workplace policy out of Italy, specifically about sick pets, basically unleashed this massive, super complicated societal debate. At a quick glance, this looked like that rare piece of news absolutely everyone could just enjoy, right? No complex economic charts, no grim arguments, but as we unpack the source material, you'll see how this single headline pulled back the curtain on some profoundly heavy questions about healthcare, taxes, and honestly, how we even define a family.
What's really fascinating here is the pure, almost universal delight that erupted online when the headlines dropped. Italy was going to allow paid leave for sick pets. This essentially made them the first country to formally recognize that, yes, an animal emergency is a totally legit reason to miss work without losing your paycheck. The reactions were off the charts. People were joking about packing up and moving to Italy, and some were even demanding paternity leave for when you bring a new puppy home. It really felt like an idea whose time had finally come for literally anyone who has ever sat in a sterile emergency vet waiting room at 2 a.m., terrified they were going to get fired the next morning.
And this policy clearly struck a chord because of a massive double standard we've all kind of just accepted. For decades, pet emergencies have been stuck in what our source perfectly calls an administrative void. Think about it. A sick child or a sick spouse, those fit super neatly into established corporate HR categories. But a pet emergency? The emotional stakes for the owner are through the roof, but the official workplace answer is usually, well, burn your vacation time, beg your manager, or frankly, just invent a case of food poisoning. It forces frantic owners into this weird corner of secrecy and managerial roulette simply because the workplace pretends the crisis doesn't actually exist.
So the really crucial takeaway here, this initial wave of excitement wasn't about, scoring a free day off just to hang out with a mildly grumpy cat. It was about something much, much deeper. It was about legitimacy. People were celebrating the fact that a pet emergency would no longer have to be disguised as something quote-unquote more respectable. The crisis could finally just be named honestly in the workplace.
But of course, the moment people started tossing around the phrase paternity leave, well, that sparks some immediate tension. Comparing a puppy to a newborn baby? Yeah, that understandably irritates a lot of parents. But the reality of the situation is pretty stark. A puppy is absolutely not a human infant, for sure. But the work doesn't just magically disappear just because payroll software doesn't have a drop-down menu for it. A terrified rescue dog might not be ready to be left alone for 8 hours. An elderly pet or a cat recovering from surgery, they still need intense, round-the-clock supervision. These are real, exhausting life responsibilities that just consume your time, regardless of whether HR officially signs off on it.
All right, let's shift gears to the exact moment this warm, feel-good story escalated into something entirely different. Someone in the public discussion looked at this paid leave policy and threw out a really provocative idea. What if we placed a small tax on pet food and pet products to actually fund universal veterinary bills? And that right there sparked a fascinating, massive question. Why should veterinary care be private at all?
Boom. With that one single proposal, we are definitely not just talking about HR policies anymore. We're suddenly plunged headfirst into a heavy moral debate. You had advocates literally arguing that universal healthcare needs to be universal, extending even to animals. But this idea, it immediately triggered some fierce pushback. People quite rightly asked, wait, why should a government subsidize animal care when so many human beings still lack adequate medical care, housing, or even paid sick leave for themselves? So this single thread took a cheerful workplace story and turned it into a complex fight about taxation, public responsibility, and exactly where we draw the line on public subsidies.
To ground this super abstract debate about universal coverage, one advocate in the discussion shared a painfully concrete and honestly heartbreaking story. Their 13-year-old cat got seriously sick, and the vets found a mass in her stomach. The estimated cost for the surgery to remove it? $3,000. This massive financial wall forced the terrified owner to seriously consider economic euthanasia. They came within seconds of having to put their beloved pet down, literally, just because of the price tag. And the detail that really lands like a punch to the gut, that mass, it was just a hairball. A highly treatable, totally common problem almost cost a beloved animal its life, simply because the owner was forced to decide how much a life was worth while completely terrified and exhausted. Now, they were lucky enough to actually have the money to move forward, but as they pointed out, so many people wouldn't be. Making a life-ending choice only to find out later it was just a hairball, that would have been completely devastating.
Which led this advocate to a really blunt conclusion. Nothing should die because money is the issue. Now, looking at this objectively, there are plenty of people who will strongly disagree with this as a viable public policy.
But the source material highlights that it's incredibly hard to just pretend the underlying moral problem doesn't exist. Tying life or tech decisions for an animal you deeply love entirely to your personal wealth, that creates a profound emotional trauma that our current systems just leave entirely up to the individual to carry alone.
But to really understand this debate, we have to impartially look at the fairness gap here because the objections are incredibly valid. Think about it. What about the coworker who doesn't even have pets but keeps getting asked to cover shifts? What about a tiny small business with maybe 5 employees that literally cannot absorb the absence? And crucially, why should workers who can't even afford animals or struggling parents who can barely get time off when their human kids are sick essentially subsidize someone else's private lifestyle choice? These are serious structural questions about fairness in the workplace and in society as a whole.
Now, supporters of these pet policies do push back against that resentment by clarifying what's actually on the table. Critics tend to imagine this wild caricature, like someone taking 3 months off work just because their dog looks a little lonely, right? But the modest policy, like the one actually reported in Italy, involves tightly limited allowances, it requires strict documentation from a registered vet, and it's reserved for serious medical needs. The whole goal is to make sure the system handles real, verifiable emergencies honestly, rather than forcing good employees to lie to their bosses.
Here's where it gets really philosophically tricky. Once public money and workplace benefits enter the chat, the source material points out that society is basically backed into a corner. We actually have to definitively answer what animals are, under the law. Are they just property, like a car or a TV? Are they entirely private lifestyle choices the society owes absolutely nothing to? Are they dependents, or are they genuine family members? Because the second you attach public dollars and legal leave to an animal, you can no longer avoid classifying their status.
But there is this lingering, undeniable reality. The law is basically always slower than culture. Sure, a company might legally classify a dog as property, and a policymaker might say pet ownership is a purely voluntary choice. But when that animal dies, that owner is still going to experience it as one of the worst days of their entire life. A manager can call a vet emergency a personal matter, but that worker is still sitting in a clinic agonizing over whether to authorize thousands of dollars in surgery. The workplace still has to function, absolutely, but the animal still needs care. Neither of those facts cancels the other one out.
This whole debate, which, remember, started with just one joyful headline, ultimately exposes a massive, fundamental cultural shift in modern homes. Because let's look at who is actually driving this change. We're talking about millions of adults living alone. We're talking about people without children, the elderly, and individuals who literally structure their entire daily routines, their housing decisions, and their social lives around these animals for 10 or 15 years. For a huge portion of the population, animals occupy an enormous emotional role. They aren't just accessories, they are the center of the home. Which brings us to our final, lingering thought for this explainer. When an animal is loved exactly like family, how long can institutions keep insisting that the crisis just doesn't count? That Italian headline really mattered because people weren't just cheering for bureaucracy, they were cheering for recognition. Recognition that love doesn't somehow become trivial just because the recipient happens to have 4 legs. As the definition of what makes a family continues to evolve, workplaces and governments are going to be facing this exact, unavoidable question more and more. Thanks for joining me for this one, and we'll see you next time.